All right, so due to technical difficulties, the class that was on Thursday, class 11, ended before the full, didn't capture all the class. So I've come back here today to do the remaining part, which is actually the part that takes care of all the non-review stuff, all the stuff officially assigned for this class. Okay, so we had 3 articles assigned for this, and this begins our treatment of the, oh, and actually it doesn't. I was going to say it begins our treatment of the negative attributes of God, but we already began that with God's simplicity. It continues it. And so we have 3 attributes we're going to look at today. God's infinity, God's being everywhere, and lastly, God's immutability. So we begin with God's infinity. And of the 3 articles, this is the one that probably has the most substance to it, or the most difficulty to it. Okay, so is God infinite? And Thomas's answer is yes, but there's going to be important ways in which God is not infinite. So Thomas has to, well, first he tells us, what does it mean to be infinite? Well, infinite really means not having a boundary or an end or a limit, a finis in Latin. So the infinite is the not finite. And this is why it's negative. It's not so much the word itself, but the fact that the things that we know are finite things. They have limits. They're this, but they're not that. Whether we're talking quantitatively or we're talking in terms of their substance. So that's what we know. We know the finite. And we get the notion of the infinite by negating that limit and saying, well, imagine there's numbers, but you can always make another one, but let's just not have an end to it. Well, that's how you get the notion of the infinite. Okay. The main thing that Thomas does, what takes up the majority of the time in the article, is he distinguishes 2 kinds of infinity. An infinity that he associates with matter, and an infinity he associates with form. So matter has a kind of infinity in the sense that there's an unlimited amount of things it could become, which isn't to say it could become everything, but if you think of metal, iron, is going to serve as our matter, how many different shapes could you form it into? Well, there's an infinite amount of possibilities there. It could become a knife, it could become a knife of many different sizes, it could become a shovel, whatever. And there's a whole lot of potential. Or a block of marble serves as matter with respect to a statue. How many different kinds of statues? Well, there's no limit to the amount that you could make. So there's an infinity in the matter, in the potency of the matter. And when the matter receives a form, well, that form limits it. It makes it to be this rather than all the other things that it could be. So matter considered in itself as a kind of infinity, but it's limited by form. However, the manner in which those things exist in matter has the notion of the imperfect because they exist only potentially. The statue of David exists potentially in the marble, but when it's actually chiseled out, it exists in a more perfect way. It exists actually. So the infinity that we associate with matter, we say it has the notion of imperfection. And this kind of infinity is not ascribed to God. He doesn't have matter to begin with, so you can't have that kind of infinity. But there's another kind of infinity, and it's an infinity that Thomas associates with form. So a form, considered in itself as a universal, is open to a variety, in fact an infinite variety, of instantiations. take the form of triangle. It has a kind of infinity inasmuch as there's an infinite variety of triangles I could draw on the board, and they would all be triangles. Or, what else could we use as an example? Well, I think Thomas used, he may elsewhere use the example of a house. The form of a house which exists in the mind of a builder could be instantiated in an infinite variety of ways. There's always some way you can make a slightly different house. But some way all those are contained in the one idea or form of house. Or you could take something like human nature. So there's the human good, the excellence of being human, and none of us embody that completely. All of us as an individual person, exemplifying some human perfections, but not all of them. Now that's going to be different than an angel. So in an angel, the one angel is the whole species. So the full perfection of that species is found right there in the one individual. Not the case with us. So anyways, Thomas ascribes to form an infinity, but he claims this form has the notion of the perfect. And when form is received into matter, then the amplitude of the form becomes constricted down to one instantiation. So the form considered in itself is open to all these perfections, all these different possible ways of embodiment, but then when it's received into matter, it's determined down to one of those. So Thomas says, the form considered in itself has the notion of perfection in terms of its infinity. And it's this kind of infinity that Thomas ascribes to God. Now, it's important for understanding this article that you don't stop there. It's not simply the fact that God, because he doesn't have matter, therefore he's infinite. Well, I mean, to some extent that's true, but you haven't yet explained why precisely where does God's infinity come from? And it's not just from not being received into matter, because the angels aren't received into matter, and they have a kind of infinity. The angel Gabriel fulfills all the possible ways of being the angel Gabriel. But God's infinity is something over and above the infinity that we find with the angels. Why is that? The reason has to do with how God is existence itself, separate existence itself, not your existence or my existence, but this separate existing existence. Ipsum esse per se subsistence, as Thomas will sometimes say, or just ipsum esse, existence itself. And Thomas has this idea that whenever a form is received into some subject, now matter is a kind of subject, so matter would count here as a subject that would receive and limit something. But it's actually broader than that. Any reception into a subject is going to be a limitation of that form. Because, as Thomas will say elsewhere, things are received according to the mode of the receiver. So the receiver will limit the thing it receives. But when you don't exist in a subject, then all the perfection that belongs to you just belongs to you. There's nothing that can limit what you are. So earlier when we talked about God's all his infinite perfection, Thomas used that example of it. If there were a heat that wasn't received in some subject, but just was a separate existing heat in the realm of the forms, it would have to have all perfections of heat. So it's the same idea here. God is existence itself, not received into some subject. And therefore his existence is not limited by the receiver. Now in the case of the angels, it's their essence that is receiving the act of existence and therefore determining it down to being this kind of existence versus that kind of existence. God there's nothing that's going to limit his existence, and therefore he's infinite. He's not finite, not limited. Okay, good. Our second one is that God is in all things, whether God is in all things, and yes, he is. Okay, a few points to note. of the three, it's probably the easiest to remember the upshot and the argument for it. There is a bit of a difficulty, I find, in understanding why this is a negative attribute. Because to be everywhere seems like a positive thing. So here's my guess. Being everywhere is not something that we know. What we know in our experience is this thing being here and that thing being there. And so we're ascribing to God that he's not like that. He's not something that exists in the way that normal things of our experience exist, namely here, but not over there. At least there's some sort of limit to where they are. So that's my guess for why it's negative. All right. The next thing that we should note are the ways in which God is not everywhere. He's not everywhere in the sense that he's the matter, kind of materially present everywhere. To be materially present would be to say that, part of him's here, part of him's over there. He's not present in that way, as if he's quantitatively spread out. Nor, of course, is he prime matter. So he's not present everywhere as the prime matter of things. Nor is he present as the form of all things, in the sense of a world soul. So if we talk about God being the form of all things, we mean God as an exemplary cause, where he's the model cause. He's not the form that's actually in the matter. So if I was making a statue, I have a form existing in my mind that I'm looking to. That's the exemplary form. The form that I'm bringing about in the marble, well, that's the form of the marble. And so by analogy, God is not that form in the marble. God would be the exemplary form that everything is created in imitation of. So he'd be both the agent and the form that is things are being modeled after. Okay, so he's not present in those ways. You need to know how God is present everywhere. He is present as an agent cause. God is present as an agent cause. And then another important thing to note here is what is God's proper effect? What's the proper effect? You might say, at least for the medievals, it seems that the proper effect of fire is heat. What is it for God? Is heat his proper effect? No. His proper effect is existence, which should make a lot of sense, right? Because for Thomas, he's ipsum esse. He's existence itself. He's not a participated existence. He doesn't share in some existence. He is it essentially. And therefore, he's that thing which has existence of its own self and so can communicate that to others. So existence is the proper effect of God. So therefore, he's got to be the agent cause of existence. Anything that exists has existence, and therefore God must be present to it as an agent cause. And not just as an agent cause that causes it to first come into being, but also conserves it in existence. So God is a continuous agent cause of your existence and the existence of everything else. So that's the reason why God is present everywhere. Lastly, whether God is immutable. Well, okay, so this is clear why this is a negative attribute of God, because the things we know are changeable. And in fact, everything in creation is, in some sense, mutable or changeable. There's degrees of that. The angels are less changeable than squirrels are, but there's always going to be some degree of mutability. But there's no mutability in God. Thomas offers us three reasons. And actually, we can arrange these three reasons so that they're pretty easy to understand, I think. So, the key to it, the key is the principles of change. All right, so everything that changes, a acquires some new aspect, new reality. That's what form means. And prior to the change, it had to not have that. Would have had maybe something else, but it didn't have that. And so that's why we need privation. And then it needs something that changes, something that it can exist in this way, but can also exist in that way. So you need a subject of the change, and this subject is always going to be characterized by potentiality. So we need a subject that provides potency. So every changeable thing needs potency. But God has no potency. He's pure act. That's argument 1, which reads like this. There's more or less. There is some first being which is pure act. It's God. He has therefore no potency. But everything that is changed is in some way in potency, right? Because it always has to have some subject that could be this way or could be that way. Reason number 1. Reason number 2 focuses on the relation between these things. Or maybe you could say these over here too, but this is the best way to draw it. So reason 1 just concerns the matter. Reason 2 concerns the composite nature. Okay, so Thomas's argument goes like this. When a thing is moved or changed, it remains the same in one respect, namely the matter stays the same. There's the same subject that existed in this way, and now it's existing in a different way. So it stays the same in one respect, but it changes in another. We had something else that wasn't, let's say, red, or maybe it was blue, and then it becomes red. So what this means is that it's composite. There's parts. This down here is different than that, for the good reason that this guy existed before without that thing. Therefore,